Happy spooky season, everybody. It's the final weekend of October, which means we've got loads of great events coming up over the next few days, including one that everybody will be able to attend because it's an online event. So please join us on Sunday, the 30th of October at 8 p.m. UK time, that's GMT, for another Evolution of Horror pub quiz. I'm going to be live streaming it on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Evolution of Horror live. Anyone can join in. You can play in teams. You can play by yourself. You simply have to watch along and play along. Jot down your answers and you can chat to me throughout and let me know how you get on. There'll be lots of different rounds on different types of horror and a few little guest appearances throughout. So please do come along and get involved. That's on Sunday, the 30th of October, 8 p.m. UK time, youtube.com/Evolution of Horror. In 1993, a new up-and-coming 29-year-old Mexican director called Guillermo Del Toro premiered his debut film at the Cannes Film Festival. This film, Cronos, about an aged man transforming into a vampire, was a quirky and beautiful mix of gothic monster horror with children's fairy tale aesthetics. It went on to become a huge critical success and was Mexico's entry for the Best Foreign Language Film at the Oscars. The film, unlike most Western vampire movies of the era, offered something both beautifully classic and entirely new, and set the template for what would become Del Toro's calling card: monster movies that were in love with the monsters.
Obviously, monsters are living, breathing metaphors that for me, half of the fun is explaining them socially, biologically, mythologically, and so forth.
Over the next 2 decades, Del Toro continued to make successful horror and fantasy movies both in Mexico and in Hollywood, and he returned to the vampire subgenre in 2002 with something entirely different to Cronos by directing the anticipated sequel to Stephen Norrington's Blade.
Ooh, so exciting.
Blade 2 provided fans with more of Norrington's kinetic, action-fueled style of the original, but it also somehow felt entirely Del Toro, introducing new creatures to the mythology that felt both beautiful and grotesque. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the vampire, and we discuss 2 Del Toro vampire movies, Cronos and Blade 2. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 8th series exploring the evolution of the vampire, and this is part 19. This week's episode is sponsored by $20 Patreon subscriber Tarquin Mandrake, and in this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be looking at 2 Del Toro vampire movies, Cronos from 1993 and Blade 2 from 2002. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific, so go and give both films a watch before listening to our discussion. So, joining me to discuss these 2 bangers, they are 2 very good friends of the pod and 2 best friends of mine. It's Matt and James from Journey Through Sci-Fi. Hi, guys.
Hey, Mike.
I don't know, I went higher and higher pitch there as I was talking to you.
Hi, Mike. It's so nice to be here.
Just really excited to have you guys here.
It's always a pleasure to be on the Evolution of Horror, Mike. We absolutely love it.
It's lovely to have you guys back. You're in a bit of a hiatus at the moment, aren't you? Is there anything... you guys have announced your next series, though, haven't you? Is that right?
Yeah, our next series is on the way, and it's going to be space opera, and it's going to be exciting and fun. So we hope everyone will join us for that when that launches.
Yes. Love it.
It should be with you in the next month or so. We're still waiting on exact dates because we're very, very busy people. But we are... we're really getting stuck into that. So yeah, keep a lookout for that when it drops.
That is very exciting. So let me ask you guys about vampires. Are you guys fans of this subgenre? It seems to have really divided people that I've had so far on the podcast. But Matt, what are your thoughts generally on the sort of the vampire movie as a subgenre?
I bloody love a vampire movie, Mike, and I've also got a really low bar of tolerance or high bar of tolerance for like bad vampire movies. Like, I don't really care about the quality of a vampire movie. I'll pretty much watch anything with vampires in or vampire adjacent. I just think they're fun, and it just doesn't really matter what's going on in them, and you get so much diversity in them as well. I'm surprised it's kind of divided your guests so far.
Yeah, vampires have kind of crossed over into more kind of, we'll talk about today, maybe sort of action movies or romance movies and that kind of thing, and maybe they're a bit less pure horror than at least they used to be back in the day. I don't know. James, what do you think of vampire movies?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of a vampire movie. I can see exactly what you mean. There was that period in sort of like the 90s, which was like our prime time for like watching these kind of films, like the 90s, early 2000s, when it was just action vampire films, and we're going to be talking about one of those today. But all stuff like Underworld and the terrible Van Helsing film. Those were the kind of things which all came out, and I remember watching at the cinema and things like that. But other than that, I was like a massive, as I know a lot of people which have been on the podcast are, I was a massive fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yes.
So, yeah, that was one of my introductions to vampires in general. And one of my personal favourites, of course, was Count Duckula, who I thought was absolutely great.
Do the horror purists not appreciate Count Duckula then?
No, actually, everyone loves Count Duckula.
Good. I'm glad.
That is unanimous, because that is a banger of a show. Yeah, Matt, what do you think is the secret to the popularity of the vampire in film?
I was thinking about this, and I was wondering if there was anything like inherently versatile about vampires, and I don't necessarily think there is. I don't think they're a very versatile monster inherently. I think it's just that because of the folklore and the history of it, they've been around for such a long time that sort of by default they've become versatile. They've just been around so long, they've been used in all sorts of stories, and you can build kind of anything around them, be it leather-clad action, be it sparkly romance. You can do anything just because people have done anything with vampires in the hundreds of years that they've existed in fiction. And I think that just gives them legs for being really enduring, because there's always some other idea for a vampire movie around the corner. And the rules are so loose as well, I think, which helps that as well. You can do what you want. Like, does a steak kill them? Maybe. Do they like garlic? They love it. You know, it's fine.
Yeah, it's true. Like, we're going to see that even in the two films we're about to talk about, I think. But people, kind of create their own vampire lore and mythology, don't they? James, what do you think about that? About why the vampires stayed so popular?
Yeah, I think it's all of those things, and the fact, like Matt said, they are so versatile as these creatures, but also sort of the way that they are feeding on people, and they're feeding on people's life force, and it's this monster which will come and get you and turn you into one of them, and it offers all these like powers and things like that. You can turn into a bat in some iterations. You can turn into like a wolf and things like that. There's all these crazy things that you can do when you're a vampire. You can fly, but you can't go out in the daylight. You can't enjoy the nice sunshine. You can't get a tan. But yeah, I think all of that, and just the creepiness of them as well, because even though they've sort of been watered down over the years, there is something so creepy about this creature which will come and suck your blood.
Yes. And there's something kind of equally alluring about it, Matt, isn't there? Like, I think it's one of the few monsters, like, you wouldn't want to turn into a zombie. You wouldn't necessarily want to turn into a werewolf, but I think a lot of people kind of would almost enjoy the fantasy of turning into a vampire. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because it's a proto-superhero. Super villain in its original form, but yeah, it's superpowers that you can get, and you also, depending on the rules of the fiction, you may become 100% more sexy.
Yes. James, do you have a favourite vampire movie?
Oh, there's just so many, aren't there? I'm a big fan of the original sort of Dracula films and all the Universal ones, and obviously Nosferatu's an absolute banger. There's loads out there, but sort of the sci-fi in me, there's a film called Daybreakers, which is like one of my favourites, which I got turned on to by some from listeners of our podcast, and it's an interesting sort of look at vampires through that sci-fi lens, and the idea of it being a plague which has struck humanity and made everyone into a vampire except for a few select humans which are still around, and just sort of the impact of that. I think that was an interesting one. Also, Day Watch and Night Watch, I remember really enjoying those.
Yeah.
It has been a while since I've seen them, so I don't know how they hold up, but yeah, that kind of more, I suppose sort of like the actiony, superhero-y vampire side of things, but equally, like, I was a big fan of Interview with the Vampire back in the day when that came out. All of those ones. Yeah, I think there's so much vampire films out there, and Dusk Till Dawn's another great one. I mean, I could just reel off pretty much your entire season, but I'll leave it there.
Matt, what about you? Is your favourite Morbius?
I was going to say Morbius, Mike. You took the words right out of my mouth.
I know you too well.
Of course, it's Morbius. Do you know what? I might have a new favourite vampire movie that we're going to talk about today, Mike.
Amazing. I love that. And that is one more, before we get into it, that is another really interesting thing that you just brought up, James, this idea of like it kind of straddling sci-fi and horror, right? Because I think there are times, Matt, when the vampire can be purely supernatural, right? But other times when they lean more into a kind of viral, almost medical angle with becoming a vampire and that kind of thing.
Yeah, again, like going to the versatility of the monster, the type of monster. They do just make up the rules however they want, and if you want to slot that into a sci-fi context, you just go down the virus route. The virus is morbing his cells, and changing him into a monster. You know, it's very easy to just go down that route, and it's same with zombies as well, though, in that regard, isn't it? You can have a viral infection in 28 days later, or it can just be there's no more room in hell, so the dead walk the earth.
Yeah. Exactly that. So we are going to talk about two movies by Guillermo Del Toro today, which is very exciting. We haven't really, I think we've covered The Devil's Backbone back in our Ghost series, and that's been about it so far. So there's probably quite a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. James, first of all, what do you think of Del Toro as a filmmaker? Are you a fan generally of his work?
Yeah, I mean, ever since I saw Pan's Labyrinth, I was a Del Toro fan.
Yes.
I mean, he's got like a good selection. He's got some bad films in his roster as well, but I think there is just something so interesting about Del Toro and the way he does it, and it's always this kind of creature feature that he likes to put forward, and you can tell he's a massive horror fan. Like, if you watch him in interviews, he's so passionate about horror and that genre. It really comes out in all of his films, and the sort of the gothic nature and visuals that he's got in them. I watched a really fascinating interview with him, actually, and he was talking about the first film that he remembers seeing when he was like a really small child was at a outside cinema, and it was Wuthering Heights. And he was in and out of sleep apparently when he was watching it, but he remembers all this sort of gothic imagery, and he always says that kind of shaped his tastes growing up. And and he'd said lots of other interesting stuff about how he would go to the only cinema, he would go on the bus to go to all these different cinemas, and all the things which were showing sort of in the day, sort of a matinee and sort of early morning screenings, were either Disney films or Italian or Japanese horror films. And he says that's really shaped the way that he makes films, the way he thinks about stuff. Like, a lot of his early stuff, I think up until Blade 2, all of his films had children in as well.
Yeah.
And obviously we'll talk about Cronos in a bit, but I think that's quite an interesting sort of juxtaposition of things to have, sort of these sort of family Disney sensibilities and horror, and for him it's sort of indistinguishable at the same time, so he kind of mixes all this stuff up. But yeah, I'm a big fan. Matt,
what about you? What do you think of Del Toro's work?
I think, like, when he's good, he's incredible, but he's got a few clangers for me that I'm not particularly interested in. I think he's like a Tim Burton with a better ratio of good to bad, and I do appreciate, like Tim Burton, I do appreciate the kind of clarity of style that he has that James was just talking about, the kind of gothic look mixed with the immediately distinctive creatures and non-human characters in his films. I respect that clarity of vision that he has, but he's got a few films that I really don't think are very good.
Yeah, I agree. I like, in some regards, I kind of love him because of everything you said, James, that he loves the horror genre. He speaks so passionately about it. He seems like a really nice, talented man. And I always feel like no matter what he makes what he wants to make. It feels like his vision. But I agree. Some of his films I absolutely love, like some of my favourite films of all time. And then others I'm not a fan of at all. Do you think there's a divide in quality between his kind of Mexican stuff and his Hollywood stuff, James? Like, do you think that's where the kind of good bad line lies, or is it not that simple with his film?
I think that it's difficult because obviously when he moved over to sort of Hollywood and got involved in all of that sort of world, he had to change his filmic style somewhat. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you look at the way that things changed from Cronos in 1993 to Blade 2 in 2002.
It's a huge difference.
They're completely different style-wise, but you can still see his horror sensibilities in both of them.
Yeah.
You've still got that sense of Del Toro as an auteur. But it's interesting just seeing, because one of the things about Cronos as well, he wrote that as an American film initially. And he wrote all the script in American, English to be correct, and then he rewrote it again in Spanish, and then sort of went with that. And there's all this kind of like, you can see how he's navigating the film industry, and that's sort of, you can tell that in the films as his sort of progression goes.
Yeah, for me, Matt, I do definitely find that I love his kind of, particularly that trilogy of sort of Spanish fairy tale movies that he has, Cronos, Devil's Backbone, and Pan's Labyrinth, are my favourites, and I kind of separate then basically everything else he's done from those three. But what about you? What do you think kind of like separates a good Del Toro movie from a bad one?
To be honest, I think when he's making a bad film, it's just boring. Like, that's the worst that his films can do for me. They just don't grab me. Like, for example, Pacific Rim, probably not his best work, but I do think it's quite a fun movie, whereas Crimson Peak I just found incredibly boring, and I just wasn't interested in at all. And same with Hellboy 2, I just found that very boring. I think there is that kind of the action necessity in his Hollywood movies, driven by a different audience, catering to a different audience. I haven't seen The Devil's Backbone, but Cronos and Pan's Labyrinth just don't feel like Hollywood movies. They don't cater to that action at all. They're a lot slower paced, a lot more interesting. And I guess that, I don't know if that sounds silly to say the slower paced films are less boring, but they just are.
Yeah, agreed. He won his big Oscar, didn't he, for Best Picture with The Shape of Water. Did you like The Shape of Water, James? Did you see that one?
Yeah, I was a fan of Shape of Water. I remember you talking about it a lot to me before I went to go and see it, and you were like, you'll enjoy this one. I was like, yeah, I definitely did. Because
I really liked it, because it kind of felt like it mixes his sensibilities a bit in that film.
And I think you're right. When he's sort of localized in his storytelling, and it's a simpler story with this kind of fairy tale element to it, which is slightly creepy, slightly gothic. You've got some sort of creature in there, and again, the fairy tale aspects, sort of the grim fairy tale sort of thing is what I get from it. That's when I think he creates these more interesting films, whereas when he's doing the big budget Hellboys and things like that, sometimes it can lose its way because he's having to stick to this American formula and do things in that manner.
Yeah. It's true. So let's talk about Cronos then, from 1993. Matt, first of all, could you just set us up with a brief plot synopsis of the film?
Yeah. So a mild-mannered antique dealer comes upon a scarab-shaped artifact from the past that stabs him and infects him somehow with some sort of mysterious serum that slowly turns him into a vampiric type creature that's decaying and craving blood, and this gets him mixed up with some bad folk that are after that ability for themselves.
Yes. So, James, was this the first time you'd seen Cronos, or had you seen it before?
I'd seen it a while back, but I couldn't really remember it. Yeah, because I had it in that trilogy box set, the ones with the films you were mentioning earlier, like Pan's Labyrinth and Devil's Backbone.
Yeah. What did you think of it, James, watching it again?
I enjoyed it more this time round. It might have helped that I didn't watch the dubbed version this time. which sort of gave it a different feel for me, because I did try watching the dubbed DVD version. I ended up getting the subbed version in the end. But there was something about it that just didn't quite... It just felt a bit too cheesy in the way it was dubbed for me to properly get it, because it won loads of awards, didn't it, and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, God, it's really difficult, I think, when you watch anything dubbed, isn't it, to kind of fully immerse yourself in it, I think. Matt, what about you? I want to know what you thought of this. Was this the first time you'd seen it?
Yeah, I'd never seen Cronos before, and it really blew me away. I absolutely loved this film. I'd say it's just like a perfect film. I've really enjoyed it, and I can also see why, sometimes a director makes just an incredible film as their first feature, and a lot of people will remember that for a long time. So when he makes disappointing movies, he's got a lot of good faith from films like Cronos. He's made other incredible films as well, but when you're coming out of the gate with a film this strong, that really sets you up for a strong career, doesn't it?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I loved this film. This is only the second time I'd seen it. The first time I watched it, I remember enjoying it a lot, but I didn't like it as much as The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth. And actually watching it again, I was like, wow, this is like you said, Matt, I think it's perfect. I actually fell in love with it watching it again this week. I think it's maybe my second favourite Del Toro film now to Pan's Labyrinth, and absolutely a top 3 vampire movie for me as well. I think all of the elements work. It looks incredible. I love its vibe, the music, the direction. I love the performances. I love these characters, the way he blends kind of quirky fairy tale with horror, the spins that he puts on the vampirism itself in this. It's a very human story as well as being a monster story. I think it sets up all of those Del Toro tropes, right? What an amazing film to kind of set your stall out with. It just feels like this is Del Toro kind of just arrived fully formed here, Yeah,
I think you can see all of the future Del Toro in this early feature. Like, even the aesthetics of it, like the Cronos device itself, the sort of the way it looks, and the sort of the fact it's got this little insect inside of it, and the little close-ups you get of what's going on inside in the mechanics. He kind of revisits that in Hellboy 2, which I know is not his strongest, but this kind of the cogs and things like that, and something about the mechanisms of watches and all of that kind of stuff. It's you see that in sort of like his visual style, but also the sort of creepiness about it, like the fact that there's this guy who is after the Cronos device, and he lives in this kind of surgical, cut off room with just these hanging statues and stuff like that, and all of it's just got this creepy sort of sterile nature to it, which is juxtaposed with this antique store and this sort of friendly granddad and all of that. And then there's just so much in it that is just that you can see that he carries on, and sort of the granddad-granddaughter relationship is something which is just like, it's so sort of heartwarming, but also the fact she doesn't say anything makes her a little bit creepy at the same time.
I was wondering what you thought of it, James.
Like, you know me,
you feel about
creepy kids are not my thing. Like, I try and avoid them in films where I can. But there was something a little bit sinister about her as well.
I love that. I never even thought of that. Yeah, I just thought she was adorable. But that is true. I kind of didn't even register the fact that
she kills a man, Mike.
She does kill him. That is really funny, that moment when she just knocks that guy out, and even the grandfather is like, whoa, he's like, what the fuck? That is true. That's great. And I mean, like, there's definitely, like you say, James, that kind of, I love how lush, one of the things I love about Pan's Labyrinth is it's got that same kind of thing where it's got the kind of cold, pale, bluey kind of world of what's really going on in this kind of fascist village, and then the kind of golden colours of the sort of fantasy world. And it feels kind of like that here, where you've got, like you say, that kind of cold, clinical hospital room or whatever it is that old man is in, with the kind of cool antique shop and all of the kind of steampunky, I guess, or Victorian kind of stuff.
Steampunky is what it is, isn't it? That kind of aesthetic.
Yeah, is this almost... I mean, would you count this, Matt, as kind of sci-fi? The fact that there are these kind of, like, devices and machinery and that kind of thing? Or is that a stretch?
Come on, Matt, it's sci-fi. This is a sci-fi horror.
It's tricky.
Hey, if every other thing that Mike can talk about is horror adjacent, this is at least sci-fi adjacent.
Well, this is going to be tricky for us to navigate as we do our space opera series, because that's going to be a lot of sci-fi that leans into fantasy, and this feels like that. Like there are the tropes of that. You've got this kind of ancient mechanical device that feels almost Stargatey, doesn't it? The scarab, but it's also just got like a magical bug inside that gives you vampirism if it stings you. I don't know. Yeah,
true.
There's some crossover there. It's got a foot in both camps, hasn't it?
Apparently Guillermo Del Toro has said multiple times in interviews that when he was growing up, he was obsessed with kind of Victorian stories and Victorian England, like Charles Dickens, and also apparently sci-fi stories like from those kind of Victorian age. So I guess you can kind of see a bit of that, can't you, in this and the way this movie looks and everything.
Yeah, I think it's the sort of... Because whenever you're looking at stuff which is fantasy and sci-fi, it's that weird sort of, like Matt's saying, the sort of the clarity over it. But I think there is definitely room for a bit of mythos and a bit of logos. That sort of, you need a bit of the fantasy side of it and a bit of the logic and the meaning behind everything. And the way that Del Toro's created this story, he's grounded it in a reality. Like there's this insect that they found somewhere, and he's made a device to put it in a machine, and then for whatever reason the science works, this crazy science that turns him into basically a vampire. But that's kind of like the grounding in the reality that it's got, but then it's still so it's so much a vampire story, but it's the twist which just gives it something different to the genre, which I hadn't seen really before this.
What do you think of this kind of initial mythology setup, Matt? This kind of device, this bug that I guess gives people kind of eternal life or eternal youth or something, doesn't it? Really?
Well, I quite liked that it wasn't really terribly important. To be honest, when the film starts with that narrated prologue in the 1500s, I was a bit like, what the hell's going on? An alchemist that lived for like 500 years and then dropped dead in an earthquake or whatever it was. But then the nature of the scarab is not that important. I think we just need to know that it gives you vampirism, or it extends your life. Let's just say that's more important to the plot, and then it's more about the way it looks, the style, the Del Toro clockwork style that you were talking about. That's purely a stylistic thing, and I felt like it more leaned into that, and the mythology of it is a bit of fun at the start. But I think it makes it a better film not to dwell too much on that. And what's his name? The sort of the antagonist, the rich guy that lives in the hermetically sealed room, the uncle. I don't know his name. Delgardia or something.
LaGuardia.
LaGuardia. I was initially expecting him to be a vampire that would be all clued up on the scarab device, the Cronos machine rather, and fully like invested in it and part of the mythology. But I liked that he wasn't. He just wanted it. He was just another human after this MacGuffin that's going to give them immortality. I think that makes it a stronger film than leaning too much into what it is and what it does and how it works.
Yeah, that's so true. A MacGuffin is quite a good way to put it. Because actually, I don't think, James, they even say the word vampire in this whole film, right? I don't think they ever actually... explicitly say this is a vampire that this man turns into.
No, I don't think they use that word per se, but it definitely, like, he's feeding on blood. It's what a vampire is. But I was thinking as well, sort of one of the other sort of influences which I saw in this was kind of Cronenberg as well, because it is so much. It's a bit of a body horror in some ways, and I suppose like vampirism and vampires are basically a form of body horror because they're changing your body and doing things to them and sucking blood. But it's interesting seeing the other characters in this film as well, because all of them have some sort of issue with their bodies, don't they? Other than Jesus and his granddaughter Aurora, like the Jesus' wife, Mercedes, she obviously wants to be younger.
Yeah.
She's got a dyed hair, it seems, and she's like doing dance classes, things like that. And then Ron Perlman's character, Angel, is obsessed with getting a nose job.
Yeah.
Like, he's just always trying to look at different plastics. He's listening to a tape about plastic surgery and me. And it sounds like some sort of health and wellness podcast or something.
Yeah.
It's really strange. But yeah, everyone's got this kind of problem with their bodies, except for, well, Jesus obviously has a very real problem with his body because he's turning into a vampire. But I found that sort of aspect of it all very interesting.
Yeah, it's true. It's a kind of really sweet moment when he first starts to look a bit younger and he shaves his moustache, and the way that his wife sort of looks at him in that moment, you know, is really nice. And I guess, I didn't really think about the Cronenberg thing, but you're so right. And actually, funnily enough, Matt, you know, we all talked together on this podcast about The Fly, right? Which we also said was pretty much a perfect film, right? And that's another thing that dwells less on the science and more on the kind of human relationships, right? Is that and is that one of the, I mean, you said you loved this movie. What was the kind of element that you loved most about it?
That's definitely in there, and I was definitely put in mind of The Fly when his skin is really like peeling off his face, but he's still the active protagonist of the film and trying to like solve the mystery or get revenge, whatever, you know, he's trying to do at the end. Despite the fact that his face is peeling off, that reminded me of Brundle. But what I really loved, what really captured me, was the more understated body horror elements. I don't know if you could even call it body horror, but it felt body horror to me. There's a scene early on where he drinks what looks like over a litre of water in 2 or 3 chugs, basically, from the fridge. Yeah. And we know that we know the context. We know that he's turning into a vampire. We've got lots of signifiers of that, and we know what the film's about. And it's a brilliant representation of a vampire not yet coming to terms with understanding his own thirst. Yeah. But also I felt the physicality of having that great of a thirst and being unable to quench it in watching a man in one take drink about a litre of water. I thought it was just an amazing and understated moment of horror, because actually seeing someone drink that much water is a little bit disturbing, and still look like he's thirsty feels disturbing. It feels wrong. That was a brilliant moment. And then it kind of doubles up throughout the film until we get to the face peeling, and it's really grim. And the midway point that I really loved as well is licking the blood off the floor. Yes. Those two moments, the water and the blood on the floor, were what really, really captured me. I found them both horrifying in a really understated way, and I loved it.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I love that sequence with the blood, because like I found, James, watching that scene, that I almost wanted him to be able to get away with it. Yeah. Like that moment when somebody comes in and washes it away, you almost feel sad for him, right? And I also really like this film. You don't quite know who to align yourself with as the story goes and as he transforms into this monster kind of thing.
Yeah, but then he's on the floor in a men's bathroom licking blood off of there. That's just not somewhere you ever want to be.
But he's licking it in that, it's such a controlled lick, isn't it?
Like a cat.
But yes, it's like a cat. Yeah, it's not like a starved vampire going crazy on blood. It's so reserved and patient, to the extent that he doesn't even notice when Angel walks in before he kicks him in the face. He's just transfixed.
And I think because it is so sort of cat-like, it seems nicer. It's got this kind of pet quality to it. Like, everybody's seen cats, and there are like adorable cats, and then you've got this adorable old man just licking blood off the floor, and somehow it's okay. It's so strange.
I like that there is a kind of sweetness to all of the relationships, right? Because there is something quite wholesome about this film, as well as being quite gross. Like the grandfather and granddaughter relationship, but then also even our kind of villains, right, Matt? Like the LaGuardias. They're a sort of what are they? A father and son, or a grandfather and grandson? I can't actually remember which one.
He's
I think
the
it was
uncle. He's Angel's uncle.
So they're an uncle and nephew, aren't they? And even those two have quite a funny dynamic between them as well, you know, where Angel, I suppose, who is the closest thing we have to a villain, this Ron Perlman's character, also is this kind of like put upon nephew living with this kind of mad uncle as well. I kind of love that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, to focus all of the comic relief around the antagonist. And it's not just that he's an incompetent antagonist that we laugh at. It's genuine humour written into it to soften the edges of those characters and make Ron Perlman, this big scary thug in this film, make him more likeable to the audience. I can't quite figure out what that means, but it is another element of just softening the horror and making it a little bit more delicate and interesting and less Hollywood, I guess, is what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's also this, Del Toro has this obsession with people that are, that are sort of physically different, I suppose. There is a character, there is a villain, obviously, in Pan's Labyrinth who kind of tears his own face open. There are often kind of disfigurements or something about them physically that makes them different. Certain characters that Ron Perlman has played in the past, including in Cronos, in The Devil's Backbone, there's a man who has one leg as well, and there is something to that, I think. James, what do you think of the Ron Perlman character in this?
I was trying to think about what he'd done before this, potentially. Like I was trying to think of his other roles and things like that, because he's such an interesting actor, because he is so imposing, and he's got this kind of, not in a bad way, but a face a bit like a brick. Like
He does. He reminds me a bit of Marv from Sin City.
Yes, he's exactly that. He's got this kind of caricature face almost.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about other roles where he played different kind of characters who weren't necessarily villains, like The City of Lost Children. I remember him playing a kind of interesting character in that. And of course, Hellboy, which is the other one that he worked with Del Toro on, and he's just unrecognizable in that makeup. But I think Ron Perlman is really good in this as being a bit of an arsehole, but there's still something about him which you can't put your finger on. Like when he's playing around with Aurora in the antiques shop, he's like popping his head up and then giving her a sweet, and he seems he doesn't really care about getting the statue. But then at the same time, his goons do come back and wreck the place and try and get the statue. So it's this kind of, you can't quite gauge him all the time, but he's still this nasty villain character, but there's just something, his motives, it's because Del Toro gives us his motives, isn't it? He knows that he's bad, but then his uncle's like even worse, potentially. Yeah. So it's kind of filtered down. Yeah,
it's really interesting. And I think, Del Toro obviously loves casting him and stuff. I think partly maybe because he has such an interesting look. And, Del Toro cast him as these kind of monsters or monstrous characters. But yeah, there is also always, like in Hellboy, there is always a kind of warmth to him as well, right? There's like a likability. And Matt, I guess Ron Perlman maybe just sort of naturally has a bit of that too, maybe in his performances.
Yeah, I think so. He's like Danny Trejo, isn't he? He's really, really imposing, physically imposing. I don't know how tall he is. I don't even know if he's that tall or if it's just that he gives off the vibe of a tall guy. But he's got an imposing physical presence. He looks tough. But he's a very good actor who can communicate a lot of warmth as well. Tough guy warmth in particular is his speciality, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, he was in Alien Resurrection too, I think, right? Was he in Alien Resurrection? Yeah. He's like one of the kind of crew on that, isn't he?
Yeah.
What do you think of, like, is it a bit on the nose, James, that you've got this main character called Jesus, basically Jesus, who comes back from the dead, right? Yeah, Jesus Christ, exactly. Like, what do you think of that and the kind of the link between sort of the what we're seeing and religion in this film?
I mean, it's definitely there, isn't it? He's got kind of almost a sort of stigmata thing going on because of where his wound is when he first gets it. It's just on the wrong side. And there's all of that stuff. And then you've also got the religious statues. You've got the angels at the start. And that's where where the alchemist has chosen to hide this device. So it's all in those bits. The fact he is called Jesus and he dies for 3 days and then comes back. It's very much like that. But at the same time, it didn't feel too in your face with it for some reason, even though he's called Jesus and he dies for 3 days and comes back. I just kind of like swept that to one side.
Yeah.
I was just so involved with him as a likable character. But I didn't have any problems with it.
Yeah, I think it's quite nice because it kind of feels like it's still... I think you're right. Like, it doesn't feel too forced because it still works within the story. Matt, what did you think of that? Did you sort of, that and all of those kind of religious allegories dropped in?
I don't mind it at all because there's an inherent link. There's always an inherent link between vampires and religion, or there is often an inherent link because crosses hurt them and they are generally demonic in a Christian way. But so I didn't mind it at all. Can I just read you the end of the plot description on Wikipedia of this film?
Yes.
He, Jesus, painfully destroys the device despite the previous warnings. Surprised to still be alive, he believes God to have saved him because of his attempted self-sacrifice. When does that happen? I don't like. He just says his name is Jesus Grease, and then it cuts to the next scene. I think that's a lot more God stuff than is actually in the film, right?
Yeah, I don't remember. He never actually mentions God saving him, does he, at that moment? I don't think.
Not in that moment. He prays earlier in the film. He says, I think it's just the Lord's Prayer, isn't it? When he's plugging himself up on the heart for the first time.
But how do you interpret the end, Matt? Do you think he's dead by the time that film ends? Like, he's lying in the bed, isn't he, with his family next to him? He's kind of survived what we thought would kill him when he kills the device, but is he then slowly dying? Is he about to die, do you think?
It looks like a death scene. It looks like a man on his deathbed, and I took it to be him dying. The thing is, the final shot is the sun is up and coming in through the window. So he's either dead or cured, isn't he? Like, it's actually quite hard to tell.
Yeah.
But I took it as death because it was the imagery of a man on his deathbed surrounded by his family.
Yeah.
And that was the visual cue I took, and I didn't want to overthink it really beyond that.
And it dips to white at the end as well, which I always think, James, it's like 6 feet under, right? I'm like, dead.
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly that. And he's made this deliberate choice not to drink blood as well, hasn't he? He could prolong his life and live longer and survive with this grey marble-like skin, which makes his name even better, being Mr. Gris, which is grey in Spanish.
Yes.
So yeah, I think you're right, Matt. I got that feeling as well, that he was on his deathbed, and that was it. His wife's comforting him, and also in that letter that he writes, he says, "I hope you'll see me one last time and sort of accept me as I am, even though I'm so changed," or something along those lines. So I think it's kind of that ending for it, isn't it?
I like that this is one of the... Because you're right, Matt, like, vampirism has always been associated with, like, religion in that it's kind of the anti-Christ, anti-Christian thing almost. But there is also something that I haven't really seen many films explore yet up until this one, that is actually likening being a vampire to being like Christ. Like, when you look at passages in the Bible about drink Jesus's blood and this idea of coming back to life, and this is something that the TV show Midnight Mass draws a lot of parallels between, right? Catholicism and vampirism, and there is actually a lot of weird parallels there, which is kind of interesting. That isn't just the basic crucifixes will save you from them, but actually a little bit more. Like, I think Del Toro is kind of subtly drawing comparisons a bit there between, being a religious icon and being a vampire kind of thing, which is
definitely. Cool. And now you pointed out, I'm really bad with like religious stuff because I just don't know a lot about it, so I often miss the references and stuff. But now you pointed out, I am surprised that there isn't more popular fiction that makes that comparison. But it would be because it comes from the kind of history of the folklore of it, isn't it? That vampirism would be born out of tales that were shocking because they subvert Christian norms of the time. So that's how you build up that kind of repertoire of tropes around the vampires. So it makes sense that there would be a link, but there's a lot of fun you could have with it in films, isn't there, if you explore it more. I need to see Midnight Mass, clearly.
Oh, it's so good. You need to check it out. So there you go. I mean, this film is next year it's going to be 30 years old. James, how do you think Cronos kind of holds up, watching it now?
Oh, I think it still holds up 100%. It's a very cohesive story. There's a nice pacing to it. It looks great still. I love all the sort of graininess in it, and the way the shots are put together. It's just got a lovely aesthetic, and still like a lovely kind of story about this old man who gets wrapped up in this totally bonkers scenario where he becomes a vampire and ends up having to sort of basically save the day kind of thing.
Yeah, and I love that sweetness of it, of like, he just sort of wants to be young and have like a nice time with his wife, it seems like, right?
And he's playing hopscotch with his granddaughter at the start. He's so wholesome, this guy.
I know, I love it. Matt, by the sounds of it, you're a big fan of this film, having just watched it for the first time. But yeah, do you think this film kind of still holds up like in 2022?
Yeah, it feels incredibly original. I mean, it was original to me because I hadn't seen it before, but it feels very fresh. It's a great story. It doesn't look dated in the style and the effects and the kind of the look of it, and it doesn't feel dated in the storytelling and the writing and the acting. It feels incredibly fresh and crisp. As I teased at the start, this is one of, if not my favourite vampire film I've ever seen. It's absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed it. I wasn't talking about Blade 2 when I said that, just to be clear. I really enjoyed it. It's a great film.
I love it. Well, yeah, I did wonder that. I was like, wow, did Matt really love Blade 2 that much?
He did, deep down.
Okay, before we get into the second film of this week's episode, let's take a moment to thank this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber Tarquin Mandrake. A huge thank you to Tarquin, and he's written me a little message, which I'm going to read for you right now. This was quite a sinister message. Tarquin says, "Listen, mate, you know what you've done. She comes for you. The clock strikes error, and the night brings terror. You should have gone to Fassbinder's 62's YouTube page and watched The Killing Moon. Milk bottles clatter down a distant pavement, spilled by the hem of her dress. Vampires alight on the bulbs of street lamps to mark her passage. She comes for you. You should have gone to Fassbinder 62's YouTube page and watched Columbia. Dead children in the undergrowth reach out through the railings with cold blue fingers and snigger. Their mouths a slurry of flesh and worms and teeth and gravel. The old man on the path tried to warn you. Just watch the second half of Hustler's Ambition. That should do it. You just swore and pushed him into the canal. A fox's anguished yowl splits the night. You should have gone to Fassbinder 62's YouTube page and watched Fashion. Now your heart thumps in time with her boot heels stamping down the hall. The door handle squeals painfully as it turns. That mouth slurps and slides and skitters into the room. She hoists one coarsely haired stump onto your bed, and the clock strikes dead. A big thank you to Tarquin Mandrake and that particularly spooky sponsor message that he sent me there. And don't forget, if you want to become an Evolution of Horror sponsor, just like Tarquin, get your own little dedicated segment where you could plug your own work, send me a message, or write something equally as creepy, then just sign up to our Patreon at a $20 level. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. One more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, $20 Patreon subscriber, Tarquin Mandrake. The spooky season is well and truly upon us. If you're listening to this episode on the day that it dropped, we are at the beginning of Halloween weekend. So much exciting stuff going on. We've got loads of exciting events happening over the next few days. I'll be hosting the Evolution of Horror online quiz on Sunday night. That's the 30th of October. I'm also going to be in Bradford on Saturday night. That's the 29th of October for a special screening of Stephen Volk's Ghost Watch. And I'll be on a panel with friends of the pod, Adam Robinson and Becky Dark, after the film. On Monday night in London, we're going to be hosting a special screening of Creature from the Black Lagoon at the Regent Street Cinema. So if you're in London or within reach of London, grab yourself a ticket for that event. It's going to be really, really special. And I will link to all of those events in the show notes. Now, over on Patreon, it's been spooktacular because, of course, we've been bringing $10 patrons an exclusive mini-series series where we have gone through and discussed every single movie in the Halloween franchise. And now it's finally come to an end because Halloween Ends is out in cinemas, which means we have now watched and discussed all 13 movies in the franchise. 13 movies across 7 episodes. And if you'd like to hear all of those discussions, you simply need to sign up to our Patreon channel at a $10 level. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. $10 per month will get you access to all of our exclusive mini-seasons, as well as a whole bunch of other bonus episodes. And next week, as a spooky Halloween special, I'm going to be revealing the results of our exclusive Patreon poll. I asked all patrons to send me in their top 10 horror movie monsters. We got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lists. We've collated the results, and in a special 2-part episode, I am going to count down your top 50 horror movie monsters of all time, starting from next week. So if you want to check out all of that and more, sign up. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. And don't forget, everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a special shout out on the podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of September a very special thanks. So a big thank you to Travis Castle, Christian Plum, Shadow Whippet, Pamela Jameson, Maymoo, Lorna, Kelly Parnham, Johan Egerkrans, Emmy Kruger, Daniel Braga, Brad S, Alison Cotton, Zach Wall, Trey Sowers, The Darker Path, Terry Nalbone, Storm Taft, Stephen Edenburn, Stephen Alexandra, Savannah Kelly, Sario, Sarah Howe, Sam, Ryan Scott, Roberto Ranaldini, Ryan, Rob Smith, Nat Ellis, Meg Bird, Matt Baldwin, Manny Rodriguez, Liam Jones, Lawrence Chapman, Kyle Faulkner, Kirsten, Kat Barrios, Juana Cordova, JT, Gillian C. Frank, Jesse Malloy, Jenny, Jennifer Lynch, Jamie Cornwell Craig, James Kemp, Gutpile97, Fern Ellis, Douglas Bradford, Diana Lopez, Denise Marino, David Britton, Craig McManus, Connor Gervin, Colin Jones, Cole Lewis, Chris Jones, Chaz Poffal, Brandy Dot, Aubrey, Anthony Pomes, Andrew Conroy, Analog Darling, Adam Morris, Arjan, and Legion Podcasts. A huge thank you to all of those people. Wow, there were loads of you that signed up in September, so thank you so much to all of you for your kindness and generosity and for supporting the podcast. And don't forget, if you want to support the making of this podcast and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. That's patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode as we talk about another Guillermo Del Toro vampire movie. This is Blade 2 from 2002.
There's a world beyond the one we know, where the powers of darkness fear nothing but one man. Blade.
We represent the ruling body of the vampire nation. They're offering you a truce. They want to meet with you.
You sure about this?
They'll take us in deeper than we've ever been.
Now, those he has sworn to kill need his help to fight a new breed of terror.
They're no longer top of the food chain.
Our forces are ready to fight, but we need a leader.
Let me get this right. You want me to hunt them? For you? Ooh, so exciting.
Okay, so we are rejoining Wesley Snipes as the human-vampire hybrids, the Daywalker. He is back, he's tattooed, he's got a samurai sword, he's doing gun fu, he's back to whip some vampires back into shape. And this time, he's having to team up with the vampires. His arch enemies, the people which are supposed to be hunting him, are now his mates. And he has to join forces with them to take down these even worse vampire creatures, which have like predator mouths called the Reapers. They're mutated vampires, and they're going to take over the world and infect everyone if they aren't stopped. So yeah,
Love
action ensues.
Action ensues indeed. So last week I talked with Chris Hewitt a bit about Blade 1, but I'd love to just hear your thoughts on the Blade franchise. Matt, do you remember much of the original Blade? Have you seen the original Blade?
Do you know what? I genuinely can't answer that question with any certainty. When I was watching Blade 2, I thought that I'd seen this film like loads of times. I wasn't 100% sure I'd ever seen it before when I was watching it. I was just watching it thinking like, is this the plot? I didn't know this was the plot of this film. I don't remember any of this. Is there a scene in Blade 1 in a nightclub where a bunch of people get killed? Okay, I've seen it.
The iconic scene in Blade 1.
But then they go into a nightclub in this film and I was like, oh, is this that film?
Yeah. There's a lot of nightclub.
They love to do it.
Yeah.
So I think I've probably seen Blade, and I think it's possible that I hadn't seen Blade 2, even though I thought I had.
And James, now you are a Marvel fan. You're
Yes,
a superhero fan,
Self-confessed.
right? Self-confessed. What do you think of the Blade movies?
Oh, they're great. The first one is brilliant.
Yeah.
This one isn't quite as brilliant. We won't talk about Trinity today. I'll probably bring it up at some point. But I think it's so good in terms of a franchise and for what it did for Marvel. It was the first film which launched Marvel back into the stratosphere in terms of being able to make films.
Yeah.
X-Men came after this. Spider-Man came after this. You wouldn't have any Iron Man. You wouldn't have any like MCU if Wesley Snipes hadn't been able to be Blade in this film.
That is quite amazing, Matt, isn't it? That Blade was kind of the original, like James said, before X-Men, before Spider-Man even. This Blade was this kind of big, successful Marvel adaptation. But in a lot of ways quite different to what we now think of as a Marvel film, I think.
Yeah. Do you think it's the strength of Wesley Snipes, just his general persona and his strength of character? Do you think that's what made it strong enough to stand above and actually become a bit of an icon and get some weight behind it?
I think it's that, and the fact that David S. Goyer put a pretty cohesive script together for the first few films, and they adapted the Blade character enough to make him more interesting than he was in the comics.
Really?
They changed some of his aspects in terms of powers and things like that. I think they turned him. Yeah, so I think initially he was just a guy who was immune to vampire bites, and he was just like a normal guy. But making him a vampire hybrid came later, and I'm pretty sure that was something that happened from the films to make it more interesting.
That's really interesting. I was going to ask you that, James, about whether or not you were ever familiar with the comics or if you ever read them before the movies.
Well, they were so sort of obscure before. I knew of Blade through the Spider-Man animated series in the 90s because he made a little guest appearance. But that was pretty much it, I think. Just seeing him there, and then obviously when the films came out and just seeing him from that. But it's interesting that Wesley Snipes didn't want to make a Blade film initially. He wanted to make a Black Panther film. I don't know if you talked about that with Chris. But yeah, he really wanted to get a Black Panther film made, but no one would put up the money for it. They were like, it will never work. I mean, they've completely proved that wrong now. But but yeah, so in the end, he just ended up taking on this character Blade, who's this lesser known sort of Marvel vampire hunter. And that sort of, and then what he did with that character is I think he had so much input into the character as well. Like, the things like what he would do in certain situations and the sort of kung fu karate stuff he's doing everywhere. That's obviously come from Snipes. And
that's really interesting about the Black Panther thing as well, because I wonder if it's got, this is something that we've talked about a lot in our vampire series, that when people want to get movies made, often putting vampires in them is the way to sell them, right? So we talked about Near Dark in 1987, and Catherine Bigelow just wanted to make a Western, and originally her script was a Western and no one would fund it, and then she was like, it's a Western with vampires, and then it got made, basically. And this idea that, again, vampires, such a popular monster, they can sort of help sell a movie. But do you think that's what added to this film's popularity, Matt, that it isn't just a run-of-the-mill superhero film, it's like a proper, R-rated kind of horror film mixed with comic book, I suppose? Yeah,
and it obviously tapped into something in the zeitgeist. I'm trying to remember if there was much before it, but we were talking about the kind of leather-clad action era of vampire films, and this feels like it might have been on the vanguard of that that whole genre. And the first one was pre-Matrix, wasn't it? So
yeah, that's what's really interesting. I was going to say is that this movie obviously is post-Matrix, so there is, I'm sure, a bit of Matrix kind of influence here. But yeah, the first one was '98. It was pre-Matrix, and it has that vibe, doesn't it? That kind of drum and bass music, that leather coat, that sunglasses, the double pistols, the big fight scenes and everything. It's like, yeah, there is something very Matrixy about it.
I think it's quite cyberpunk, isn't it? And that's come from all those elements, and yeah, it's all fed in from sort of Japanese culture, I feel, a little bit as well, in terms of those kind of things which were happening at the time.
Mm-hmm. So I haven't properly asked you guys what you think of this one. James, you said you not quite as good as the original. Matt, what did you think of Blade 2?
It's pretty good, isn't it? It's all right.
I thought it was Morbin time again.
No, it's fun, isn't it? I do think that I had it in my head that this was one of the greatest films ever made. I don't know why. I just remember. I think everyone I know loved it when it came out, and that's all. And I clearly haven't watched it possibly ever, or certainly not very much in the interim years. So that's just what stuck in my head. It's like, this is one of the greatest sequels ever made. Brilliant, classic superhero movie. And I was watching it back and just thinking, it's none of those things. But it's good fun. It's a really solid, good fun action.
But also, Matt, you're comparing it to other films which have come since. Was this the film that made other films better because they learnt from the mistakes?
Maybe, but I can also compare it to films that came before, and there are better films before it. There's better films either side.
I thought I'd take a punt at changing your minds. It didn't quite work.
It's good. It's a good fun. Wesley Snipes is super cool. Luke Goss is really good in it. It's got some good action. It's fun.
You know what might have made it even better for you, Matt?
What?
At one point, they were talking about having Morbius be the villain.
I know, I read that. And I think the director of the first film was in a deleted scene as Morbius in the first film. He's at the end of the movie, but they cut that out. So I don't know if that's ever seen the light of day.
To begin with, I thought you were talking about Del Toro in this one, playing Morbius.
Oh, yes.
Amazing. Originally, the director was playing...
I'd watch that Morbius film.
I like this film. I think it's just personal taste for me in that I'm not the biggest fan of the kind of big shooty action films very much. I'm really enjoying Blade up to a point, and I like the story, and in this movie I really like the monsters. I guess that's a bit of the Del Toro element. But when it does then just get into the big long action scenes, I do find myself sort of drifting off and checking my phone and checking the time and stuff. And I think that's just... And I've had this problem with every single Marvel film I've seen since. It gets to the big third act fight scene and I just start to glaze over a little bit. And I always find that. And I think for me, action films just aren't my favourite genre. I've still never seen the John Wick films, even though everyone tells me they're excellent. But again, a lot of those sorts of films just aren't... They don't interest me very much, really. And I think I would love, I'd love a little bit more character stuff in this movie. It's good to see Ron Perlman in this, but I wish he was doing more interesting things. And I feel like this movie is way more interested in its cool visuals and fight scenes than it is story or anything else, I suppose.
Yeah,
which is fair.
It's very thin on character development, isn't it? To say the least.
But that's what it is. It's a movie where you go and enjoy all the action and
the banging soundtrack.
Yeah,
come on. I was looking at the soundtrack and the people which are doing. They've basically it's dance producers with rappers teamed up, and I was just like, this is amazing. It's so much more rappy than the first soundtrack, so I was obviously loving it. They've got a track with Massive Attack and Mos Def, which I remember listening to off the back of it, and Paul Oakenfold and then Ice Cube. And
that's funny. I mean, you just can't imagine that being Guillermo Del Toro's decision, right?
That's not Del Toro.
Right? When you think of the music that's in Cronos as well, and it's there's no way that this was and then this is the classic thing, isn't it, of when you get a filmmaker become part of the Marvel machine, you think how much of this was his... Did he have a say in, I suppose? But yeah.
I just after what Jane said, I was just looking up the list, and it is astonishing some of the pairings they've got on there. Massive Attack and Mos Def, like James just said, there's Fatboy Slim and Eve doing a track together. This is crazy. I need to put this on. Gorillas and Redman together at last. Although that's more in character with Gorillas, isn't it? But still, yeah. Hey, good stuff. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't feel like Del Toro sat down and curated these musicians.
Nah, I feel like Wesley probably had more of an influence on sort of picking some of these things.
Yes. So, what can you tell, James, that this is a Del Toro movie in comparison to the first one? Like, can you see any of those, especially after the back of talking about Cronos, can you see any of those Del Toro touches on Blade 2?
Yeah, I think as Matt said a little bit earlier, it's the kind of creatures that they've got in here.
Yeah.
Because it's very much a monster movie, isn't it? It's got the vampires and it's got these new mutant vampires, the Reapers, which are very much like this new creature, as I said, like they're proper monstrous, aren't they? They're something completely different to what we've seen vampires as before, and they make the other vampires look less scary so that they can be a bit more approachable, and so approachable that Blade actually strikes up a romance with one of the lady vampires. So it's really interesting seeing all of those things, and again, it's kind of like, I know at one point Del Toro was worried about taking on this film because they've got quite a lot of underground scenes and people chasing stuff underground. He was like, I've made Mimic, I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
So he really wanted to focus on like the blood bank stuff and all of that kind of thing that was coming in the story. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you can see Del Toro's influence on it. I mean, he directed it. Of course, had an influence, but it's very dark and dank and gothic, and at the same time, you can see when he comes out with Hellboy later, you can see all of the comparisons.
Hellboy feels more Del Toro than Blade 2, I would say, doesn't it? Yeah,
it's more fantasy, but you've got like leather-clad vampires with night vision goggles doing samurai stuff, and that feels very, very Del Toro for some reason.
As soon as we got those two vampires coming in those costumes with the eyes that kind of went, narrowed and widened, I was like, oh, that looks like a Hellboy character or a kind of steampunky Del Toro character, doesn't it? Yeah. Matt, could you feel that kind of Del Toro, directorial stamp on this?
Yeah, definitely. It looks like a Del Toro movie, as most of his films do. He's got that consistency of look in his films, and it's mainly around the creatures, and the costumes, but also like the lighting and some of the sets are quite characteristically his work, especially his Hollywood work. So yeah, I think he's put his author's stamp on the film very clearly for me, even though maybe script-wise it doesn't feel like he's had much input on the script.
Matt, what do you think of, like James said, you've got these vampires and then you've got these kind of new creatures introduced in this one, these Reapers, right? That are kind of like uber vamps kind of things. What do you think of those and those designs?
I think it's great. I think it's a good example of how loose you can be with the rules of a vampire film, that you can just create another species of vampires. Now, I'm a big fan of the saga of Darren Shan. I never read Harry Potter. When everyone else was reading Harry Potter, I was reading the saga of Darren Shan, which is like Harry Potter but vampires.
Right.
And there's like a whole war in that between the vampires and the other race of vampires that are even worse and more scary. It's just a great little thing that you can do, is just invent a whole other type of vampire that's worse. It's a great sequel thing to do as well, isn't it? To just be like, we got a worse kind and now we got to work together to get rid of them.
Yeah, I think James Del Toro said that he wanted to make this almost like a bit of a Dirty Dozen thing, right? Where you've got Blade teaming up with this other group of vampires. What do you think of this kind of new group of what do they call them? They've Reapers. Got a name for them, haven't they? The
Blood Pack.
The Blood Pack.
Blood Pack. What an awesome name.
And Ron Perlman is one of those, right? What do you think of the Blood Pack, James?
I mean, they're setting them all up to get killed, aren't they, at the start? Which is great. It's like, here, we're going to introduce all these really cool-looking vampires, which are going to kill these Reapers, but they're obviously not. They've got like a guy called Lighthammer, haven't they? And things like that. And then they've got Donnie Yen playing a character called Snowman. Donnie Yen being like an amazing like action martial artist in loads of films. He's fantastic. Very underutilized in this, but he's great. And they've got all of these really cool people playing these extra vampires. And then they've got Danny John Jules, a.k.a. the cat from Red Dwarf in there, which I was just like, what? Why is he in there? Last thing I saw him in was the BBC drama where it's like Murder on an Island or Murder Island or something.
Yes.
It's like one of those Saturday daytime things. But I was like, Danny John Jules in Blade 2? Amazing.
That is great. I had no idea actually that was him. That's brilliant.
I was quite shocked to see him as well. Yeah, I love hearing his normal voice. Well, it's not even his normal voice, is it? Because he's still doing an American accent, but just not doing the cat's voice is always very jarring.
Yeah.
There is again something, James, like kind of sciencey in the mythology of Blade, isn't there? There's a lot of focus on blood and but the actual kind of medical side of blood, and it's all about like mixing blood and serums and adapting blood things, and it's all about like curing vampirism or enhancing vampirism with science, isn't it? In this, which I'd completely forgotten about until I revisited.
Yeah, again, it's kind of grounding it in that kind of reality of the world that Del Toro is creating in this. The fact it's all genetics, isn't it? They want to create a superior vampire. It's even eugenics, isn't it? Because they want to create the ultimate vampire who can look exactly like the old daddy vampire with his like crusty marble skin or whatever it is. So he wants to make children that look like him that can go out in the day and completely take over the world. Mm-hmm. So it's that kind of side of things, which is quite interesting. Like when he brings out this big load of fetuses, which just come up from the floor, and then Rob picks one up and he just has a little look. It's just like, oh, but that kind of sciencey aspect's really interesting, and I think it does kind of, I feel like that's come from Del Toro as well, because he did say he was more interested in that kind of like the blood bank and the genetic side of things with this. And for a vampire film as well, it's another kind of interesting angle. Like, what can you do with vampires next? Let's add in some pseudoscience and just throw that in.
I like that there's all these different types of vampires. And right, in this world, you can be born a vampire, right? You're like a pure blood. And so vampires can actually procreate and give birth to baby vampires and everything. So like they're an entirely different actual race in this movie, aren't they?
And they're nice. They're nice, apparently, the pure bloods. Well,
fine.
some of them are. Some of them are.
Yeah, because it's actually the villain in Blade 1 is Deacon Frost, who is the half-blood prince. No, not the he's the half-vampire, half-human kind of character.
He's the blood god.
Yeah. Matt, we've got little Norman Reedus in this film. Did you enjoy him? And did you guess that he was going to be a baddie as well?
No, I didn't.
Old Scud.
Which again made me think I hadn't seen the film before. No, didn't.
The best sequel ever made. You hadn't seen it.
I didn't see that. Didn't see that coming at all. Actually, to be fair. But then it was actually quite disappointing, the reveal, to be honest, because it's a big reveal that he's been a traitor all along, and then Blade just goes, "Nah, I already knew."
I knew it. Yeah.
there's no real narrative weight on that.
You can't fuck with Blade. He says
no, and he just blows him up.
Times. Yeah, it's like, fuck you. He's got some great lines, hasn't he? He's like, "You must not know who you are fucking with."
So good. And James, apparently Del Toro also wanted to, I think you mentioned this already, but he wanted to throw in Japanese animation style visuals in this as well. Now, as you guys know, I'm not very up on Japanese animation in general, but James, could you see that link, that connection?
Yeah, I was thinking about it before we did the episode today, and it's definitely in there, because like you talked about the Matrix influences, but obviously the Matrix was influenced by things like Ghost in the Shell and Akira and that kind of aesthetic, but also there's stuff like Vampire Hunter D, which is basically a half-blood vampire who goes around in this post-apocalyptic world with a big sword fighting vampires. So that seems like a direct reference. And there's another one which reminded me of, again, from sort of 80s, 90s, called Blood, the Last Vampire. And in that one, it's a Japanese... she basically looks like a Japanese schoolgirl, but she carries a katana with her. And it's kind of implied that she's the last remaining vampire, and she just goes slicing up all these creatures and stuff like that. So that the fact, like, I think there's something about having a big sword and killing vampires with it that seems quite Japanese as well. Like the sort of samurai nature of it and the katanas and all of that. And again, the way he's fighting is it's like Japanese martial arts, isn't it? I mean, Wesley Snipes is trained in several types of karate and capoeira and who knows what else. But all of that comes in the way he's dancing around. But then, of course, you do get a few crazy CGI flips, which date it a bit. But
yeah, some of the CGI. Yeah. James, Matt, did you see that kind of Japanese Eastern influence on this film?
Yeah, they fight like they're in anime. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I'm surprised that Wesley Snipes has got all that training, because I didn't think he was very impressive in the choreographed scenes.
You need to watch Blade 1.
Is he more?
Because in Blade 1, I feel, because there's no CGI in that. It's
right.
Just,
I didn't think the CGI looked too bad, to be honest. I thought they had aged quite well in Blade 2. But when it wasn't CGI, the choreography around Wesley Snipes, I was getting Steven Seagal vibes from...
I mean, he suplexes someone, doesn't he? And things like that, which throw it off a bit.
With heavily edited suplexing. A lot of cuts in that suplex.
Even when I was really fascinated by the way he shoots his guns. He doesn't shoot his guns like a normal person. He's like punching with them.
Yeah.
Like, did you notice that? I found that hilarious.
Yeah. It's, and again, like, I do think maybe this is both a positive and a negative of Del Toro, that he does make his films look a bit cartoony, maybe, doesn't he? Which is not always, like, and maybe that's why a lot of people do prefer Blade 1 to Blade 2, because Blade 1 feels a little bit more visceral, doesn't it, I think, as an action film, and this film is a bit more outlandish and sometimes visually really cool, but maybe it can feel a bit weightless as well as an action film or something. I don't know.
Yeah, again, it's kind of like comes down to the localized nature of it again, doesn't it? Like we were talking about Cronos, because it's all in sort of, it's all together in one place almost, whereas this, they're going all over the shop, they're going underground, they're going to blood banks, they're in Russia, they're going to the big fortress. There's lots of travelling around.
It's got quite a lot in it's almost a Bond movie, isn't it? It's a globe-trotting adventure to defeat the bad guys. He's got with his gadgets. He's got like a Q character that helps him out, but comes on the mission in this case.
Can we talk about the Q character? So Whistler is back, Chris Christopherson in this one.
Yeah.
I was just like, how is he back? He basically gets killed in the last one.
I had to ask Mike, before you joined the Zoom, James, I was asking Mike, because I hadn't rewatched Blade. Like, I thought it's just really weird, isn't it? They just spend like 20 minutes retconning his death to bring him back to life. It's strange.
Yeah, he's just in a big like glass chamber of blood or something, right? He's just been kept there the whole time.
But he's been turned, and then Blade gives him the magic antidote. I mean, if the magic antidote is that good, why doesn't he just use it a little bit more on other vampires?
Why doesn't he use it on himself so that he doesn't have to drink blood?
Yeah, he's a special case, isn't he? Because he was born half vampire, half human.
And I think Blade 1 does end with him sort of making the decision that he wants to stay a vampire because he wants to, you know, help people and help kill them. So keep his super strength, even though
help
that
people
means...
and help kill them.
help kill the vampires. And he decides he just wants to carry the burden of needing to inject himself to get rid of his thirst, you know, however many times a week or whatever it is, in order to, you know, stay as a day walker. But it is all a bit contrived, I think, so that they can reset the equilibrium back to him and Whistler together right at the beginning.
It's a great duo, but the retcon's a bit forced.
Well, there you go. I wanna finish by asking you about Blade Trinity. Matt, I'm guessing you've probably not seen Blade Trinity.
No, I haven't gone back to the well again. I don't know if I will, to be honest.
No, me neither. James, what are your memories of Blade Trinity?
Oh, it's absolutely mad. Triple H, the wrestlers in it. They've got the guy from Prison Break. I can't remember his name. I think he plays Dracula or something. It's got Ryan Reynolds, who is playing a guy called Hannibal King, but because he didn't like, nobody liked the Hannibal King character, so the director basically said, here's some Deadpool comics, just style your character on Deadpool. And that was the start of how Ryan Reynolds ended up being obsessed with trying to play Deadpool, and then that happened. So if you watch Blade Trinity, he's going around with two swords, and he's wisecracking because it's Ryan Reynolds. And then you've got Jessica Biel with a bow and arrow, just firing that about. I think she almost broke her back when she was making it. It's just an absolutely mental film. And also, Wesley Snipes was so pissed off with it, he's barely in it, and he was like, he basically sued the studio because he was so unhappy with it, and he said, that they were being, I don't know the exact ins and outs of it, but he sued the studio and was not happy with it at all. And he was just being really, really fussy about stuff. There's like a deleted scene where apparently Blade's dead and he opens his eyes or something, but they had to CGI the eyes because Wesley Snipes refused to open his eyes. And he was just like, and then there's bits when he was just like staying in his trailer and said, just get my stunt double to do it. I'm not doing it.
Wow.
So lots of crazy stuff about that film.
And there is a moment in it where Ryan Reynolds calls somebody a cock-juggling thundercunt.
They drop a C word in Blade 2 as well, don't they?
Did they? I missed that.
Yeah, they say like by a cunt hair. I was really taken aback by it. I was like, what?
That's quite a nice use of it.
God, Ryan Reynolds was a bit like the kiss of death for superheroes for a while, wasn't he? Because Green Lantern as well, yeah.
Green Lantern, the Wolverine film when he played a Deadpool with his mouth shut, like sewn shut, which defeats the whole object of that character.
The Rotten Tomatoes score for Blade Trinity is 25%. I think I am going to watch this film. That sounds.
I think we can watch it on our new segment on Patreon, Matt.
Okay, yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And James, finally, I want to ask you: there is now, it's been confirmed, right, that we're getting a new Blade movie in the MCU coming out in the next couple of years. How do you feel about this?
Yeah. Mahershala Ali's playing Blade, which I think is an amazing casting choice. I think he'll be great. It has had lots of ups and downs already. I think the director's already changed, but Mahershala Ali's already made a sneaky cameo in one of the Marvel films. It's a really shit cameo. Basically, you just hear his voice at the end of the Eternals film and saying something to one of the characters. But of course, I lost my shit.
These things are made for people like you, James, and that's great. That's
absolute sad fanboys. But I'm fully aware of all that. But yeah, I think Mahershala Ali could be an amazing Blade if he's given the right director and the right film, and they have to make it at 18 because you can't do Blade. They probably won't, but I feel like you can't do Blade properly unless it's brutal.
Hey, I'm quite. I mean, I love Mahershala Ali. I think he's an amazing actor. I'm really excited to see him do this. But I kind of thought they'd go younger. Like, he's 48.
Yeah,
Mahershala Ali. It was quite surprising actually that they would cast him, from this age, potentially in multiple films, right? Which is interesting. But yeah, maybe Blade is supposed to be a slightly older character? Is he? I don't really know.
Well, he's supposed to age slower than other people.
Yeah,
maybe he's been around for a long time.
Yeah, you think they'd get some new, like 20-something actor to come and do it, but
Mahershala Ali looks great for 48. So if you want a character that doesn't look like his age, you don't want to roll the dice on a 20-something. You need to get someone who already looks great at 48.
Also, like, it feels like Marvel are trying to go for the really big proper actors now, aren't they?
Right. Yeah, he's an Oscar
winner. Although it doesn't always work, they're trying to do it, aren't they? Because I remember all of the hoo-ha when they got Brie Larson to do Captain Marvel. It was like, oh my God. So it's like, it feels like that kind of thing.
And it's going to so Blade will tie in to the MCU, will it? It will be part of whatever it is, phase 8. Whatever we're on. Yeah.
They're structuring it so there's like lots of different divisions of it. I think they're saying like there's street level heroes and then there's the big Avenger heroes, and they're doing it kind of like that. But Blade could potentially be part of this sort of darker MCU, like Wolf by Night, which is the next sort of horror-esque Marvel film coming out. I feel like that's going to have connections to Blade, and apparently it's going to have repercussions for the MCU. As they say with every fucking film that comes out. But yeah, you should look into Wolf by Night though, Mike, because it's black and white. They're making it. I think it's releasing. I feel like it should be releasing in Halloween, but who knows? But yeah.
I was very cross by the last Marvel quote unquote horror film, which was the Multiverse of Madness, which I thought was rubbish, absolute rubbish. So as long as it's better than that, then
I'm sure it will be. We'll see.
Amazing. Well, there you go. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me to talk about these two films. It's been so much fun. And Matt, just remind people if they want to come check out some Journey Through Sci-Fi before the new series kicks off, binge the first 5 seasons, where can they find you?
Yeah, we've got 5 series of the show ready for you on your podcast app. We're called Journey Through Sci-Fi. If you want to find out more about us, we've got a website, journeythroughsci-fi.com, or you can find us by searching for us on whatever social media you like to go on. So come and check us out. And you can join us on Patreon, patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, where there are no breaks between seasons. We are putting out content all the time. So you can come and listen to us there. And listen to Mike on there a few times.
Oh, speaking of sci-fi horror, you guys are doing... You're in the middle of your Terminator series, right, James, at the moment?
Yes, we are. And Mike very kindly joined us for an episode on the first Terminator film.
That was so fun.
Yeah, we're going to be putting out the reviews of the sequels as we continue on the Patreon feed. It's going to be interesting, guys. It's going to be interesting.
Cannot wait. Guys, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
Cheers, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's brilliant guests, Matt and James from Journey Through Sci-Fi. So let me know what you thought of this week's episode and what you think of this week's films. Do you love Cronos as much as me and Matt and James do? And what do you think of Blade 2 in comparison to Blade 1? Please do get in touch. Don't forget, you can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which you can find on Facebook. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It only takes 1 minute, and it really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So onwards to next week then, and next week we're sticking in the 1990s to discuss 2 lesser known but really interesting art house vampire movies. Next week I'm going to be joined by James Rendell, and we are going to be talking about 2 movies from 1995, Larry Fessenden's Habit and Abel Ferrara's The Addiction. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.